Hello and welcome to the 25th and last in my series of presentations on the conflict between science and creationism. Today I'm going to be covering the last few miscellaneous bits and pieces that I haven't covered so far specifically in any of the previous 24 presentations. As ever, I'll be looking primarily at claims made in the presentations of the infamous young Earth creationist Kent Hovind. I just wanted to make sure that I didn't leave any rocks unturned and that I answered all his main points before the end of this presentation series. I fully plan to go back and look at some of the topics I've covered here in much more detail, and I've already started planning a new series of talks on specific topics, so watch this space. Anyway, let's get started. This is a rather random claim that Hovind hints at several times in his slides. He's attempting to prove that the Earth is very much younger than it really is, and one method he invents to do this is to look at leap seconds. A leap second, as the name suggests, is an extra second added to our day, as happens roughly once every couple of years. The reason for this is because the definition of a second is no longer taken from the Earth's orbit, but is defined according to the decay of a precise atomic state in a certain isotope of cesium. And it isn't quite equal to 1/86,400th of a day, where 86,400 is 60 times 60 times 24, or the number of seconds in a day. Hence, if we count seconds ultra precisely, we find that we lag very slightly the rotation of the Earth. And hence every year we fall behind by approximately 0.6 seconds the actual position of the Earth in its rotation. Of course, this is not detectable to the naked eye, but if you left it a century then the difference would be about a minute, which means that after 6,000 years of continued lagging at this rate, our clocks would be about an hour behind. However, Hovind misunderstands the concept of a leap second completely. He suggests that the leap second is caused by the Earth slowing down in its rotation. If it can slow down at this rate, 1 hour every 6,000 years, then the maximum possible age for the Earth is therefore 6,000 years times 24 hours, or 144,000 years, not the billions of years accepted by scientists. Well, the flaw or flaws here are rather too obvious to point out. Hovind simply doesn't understand what a leap second represents for a start. The Earth's rotation is indeed slowing down, but by a more minuscule 1.7 milliseconds per century, which is 35,000 times slower than Hovind suggests. And which means that the time it would take for it to slow down to its current rate, assuming that the slowdown has been linear, should be something like 5 billion years, which is a more respectable number. I've mentioned before that truth is not democratic. You don't vote on what's true or not. You vote on what you prefer to be true, but not on what actually is true. And of course, the number of people holding a theory gives no indication whatsoever about whether or not that theory is correct. However, it does give some considerable weight to the claim that a theory should be taken seriously. This is Hovind's claim for creationism, but of course he misses the point that creationism has been taken seriously. It was investigated for a long time, many centuries, and thoroughly rejected. But when we consider how many extremely highly educated experts accept the truth of evolution and the old Earth, and when we start to think about what that entails, it becomes an intriguing argument. Hovind seems to be claiming that there are some flaws in prevailing modern scientific theories that are so obvious that he can explain them to a crowd of non-experts in a few seconds, but which the actual experts somehow fail to see or to understand in decades of painstaking research. This point of view really puzzles me. Why are the scientists not convinced by Hovind's arguments? If they were a select few in some mysterious shadowy organisation, like he sometimes seems to insinuate, then it would be obvious. But given that the number of practising scientists in the life and earth sciences worldwide numbers in the millions, then why exactly is it that they don't see the genius of the young Earth arguments? Why is it, in contrast, that they instead insist on pursuing this completely different story that the Earth is 4.6 billion years old, a figure that seems to be agreed upon by a number of different sources? How on earth could so many people spend their entire lives gathering painstaking evidence in support of a hypothesis, and all agree, and yet all be wrong? Moreover, if they're wrong, where are the flaws in their measurements? It's no point arguing that you may also have some observations that are consistent with a young Earth. You also have to disprove all the evidence for an old Earth. And of course nobody can do that, despite the fact that there's an incredibly large incentive for anyone to do so. After all, that's the sort of thing that gets you a Nobel Prize, and much more. The Nobel Prize alone is worth something like €1 million, I believe, plus a job for life, book deals, TV appearances, etc. I think we have to be careful when we deal with the fact that the overwhelming majority of people who look into the science behind evolution and the scientifically accepted age for the Earth come away accepting it wholeheartedly. Of course, millions of people believe all sorts of strange things that are false. But we have more than that here. We have a huge public network of experts from all corners of the world. They've gathered vast towers of information in a wide range of disciplines, all of which seems to tie in very well indeed. They have no reason to collaborate together to hold a lie. They are individually incentivized to find flaws in existing hypotheses and come up with their own hypotheses that are better, more explanatory, or more plausible, if they were to exist. In short, there is a system set up which is ideally tuned to find any flaw that should exist in the scientific theory. And despite the fact that millions of people are working in this system, they find nothing more than the occasional minor tweak. And that can only really lead to one single conclusion, that the scientific viewpoint is wholly and undeniably true. My strong belief is that scientists should never debate creationists, because it just boosts the creationist public image and encourages the public to think that the creationists might have a plausible argument, which of course they don't. And besides, they generally have slick presentations, oodles of charisma, and an audience stacked heavily in their favour. It takes 100 times longer to disprove many of their claims than it does for them to claim them in the first place, so you will never disprove the majority of what they say, and that just means that every debate turns into some sort of propaganda victory for creationism. So the bottom line is, if you debate them, there's no way you can win. But if you are called on to debate a creationist, either formally or informally, here's a few really important guidelines that you should bear in mind. Firstly, if you don't know, don't lie. Often creationists will bring up some anecdote that you've never heard of. Normally they're just unsupported stories with no basis in truth, but you look foolish if you ridiculed them and they turned out to be true. Be honest and say you don't know, but keep a sense of proportion. If there is some amazing bit of evidence waiting to be discovered, then that's exciting. Ask them to show it to you. Keep in mind what an amazing spectacle a find like a 3-metre tall human skeleton would be, and how it would be front-page news across the world with exhibitions in the biggest museums. The fact that there are no such exhibitions seems to indicate that such skeletons don't exist, and I'll be talking about them on the next slide. Disproving evolution would be a monumental occasion. Any piece of evidence doing so had better be good, and if it's sufficient, then it would be famous and studied by all the top scientists. It would revolutionise science as we know it. Demand that level of evidence. Whatever you do, if you don't know a story, don't just presume it's stupid, because it might not be. Also, don't accuse your opponent of lying, unless you can prove it. There's no quicker way to get an opponent and an audience well and truly against you. If you can prove it, then give them an out. Suggest they might be confusing something with another story, for example. Secondly, this is important. Keep things in perspective. What we're trying to do is to show that science is right about the origins of the universe and life, and that creationism is either wrong for the old Earth variety, or utterly insane, absurd and ridiculous for the young Earth type. Digressions about whether or not animals on the Ark might have been vegetarian or not are irrelevant. We're trying to find out what's true, not what someone wants to be true. Also, bear in mind that every scientific conclusion is probably backed up by dozens of different and independent lines of evidence. If a creationist shows that one of them happens to be a bit shaky, that doesn't crumble the entire edifice of science. And finally, don't worry, you're right. Whatever their supposed disproof really is not going to be any good, so don't panic. The biblical story of David and Goliath is often told as an example of how brains and courage can win out over brute strength and might. It's almost certainly little more than a folk myth, embellished and fictionalised over time. To a rational human being, that is, not to a young Earth creationist, of course. They believe every word the Bible says, so they must indeed believe that a man who was allegedly 9 feet tall terrorised the ancient Israelite armies, which also didn't exist. Actually, it depends rather which texts you read. The later texts say Goliath was 6 cubits and a span, which translates to 9 feet or around 2.7 metres tall. But the Dead Sea Scrolls, which contain much older versions of the original text, which should therefore be much more trustworthy, say he was only 4 cubits and a span, which is 6'6", or roughly 2 metres tall, which is much more reasonable. It's still incredibly tall for that day and age, but at least physically possible. Or maybe it was using the short cubit measurement, in which case it translates to 6'9", or a little over 2 metres tall. That's pretty crazy, but within the bounds of a mild exaggeration. Hovind claims that the size of Goliath isn't outrageous because there are records that the Roman Emperor Maximinus Thrax was 8'6", or 2.6 metres tall. But that's obviously an unreliable source of information. There are no reliable sources showing this, with basically just one reference in Herodian's Historia Augusta, which also cites known fictional sources. If there had been 3-metre-tall giants roaming the land, and the Bible clearly says that there were giants alive in recent history, then there would be evidence of them. Skeletons, clothing, weapons, houses. Of course we have none. If Hovind can produce a single skeleton, then the argument is over. But, of course, he can't. I have a convenient law which I use for dealing with conspiracy theories. So far it's never been disproved. It's simply this: all conspiracy theories are wrong. Hovind, as part of his "I'm just an honest man being persecuted by nasty scientists for seeking out the truth" routine, delves well into conspiracy theory territory on several occasions. I think he believes pretty much all of them, to be honest, though I may be maligning him unnecessarily there. But the thing about conspiracies is that they're basically impossible. That's not to say that there aren't shadowy organisations working behind the scenes, such as MI5 and the American CIA. I won't even deny that they have been responsible for some pretty devious stuff in the past, attempting to overthrow governments and the like, but that's basically about it. In fact, any example you're now thinking of as an example of a conspiracy theory that was actually true is probably one of the following. Either one, it wasn't really a conspiracy theory at all, such as the belief that some people in the armed forces or in the police are criminals. Of course they are. That's not very surprising. There are criminals in all walks of life. Or two, it was a conspiracy, but there were never conspiracy theories about it, like, for example, Watergate. Lots of people quote that, but there was never a conspiracy theory about it beforehand saying that the government was bugging their opponents at hotels. It just happened, and then it was all over the news within hours. 3. Maybe it just wasn't true. Yes, I know you think that Elvis is still alive, but he really isn't. Or 4. It was a conspiracy, it was hypothesised, but within almost no time at all the entire story was leaked with copious evidence, like lots of corporate misdeeds, for example. The thing about conspiracy theories is that they give often very lonely and perhaps unhappy or angry people the opportunity to believe that they are valiant warriors fighting the side of good against a vast evil force. People believe in conspiracy theories usually because they're good people who want real life to be like the movies and the books that they love and want to be the hero who's renowned throughout history for saving the world from some hideous fate. It's an extremely seductive and addictive belief system. So conspiracy theorists, despite the fact that they often cause huge emotional or even physical damage to others, truly and honestly believe that they're doing the right thing. It's a really difficult problem, but it's one that can really only be dealt with by teaching people how to think rationally. A conspiracy, one that involves more than a small number of individuals, is basically impossible to keep secret. It just can't be done. And when they start involving entire companies or entire professions, then that's where you know that someone's delving deep into delusional territory. So yes, I know you think it's true, but no, autism is not caused by vaccinations, the American government did not cause 9/11, Elvis is dead, pharmaceutical companies are not poisoning us to keep us ill, global warming is real, Neil Armstrong did land on the moon in 1969, an experimental balloon landed in Roswell, New Mexico in 1947, not an alien spaceship, Princess Diana was not murdered, there is no New World Order, Freemasons are just groups of guys who like drinking beer in private, and the world is not ruled over by a race of shape-changing, blood-drinking lizard aliens. Sorry to disappoint you. Most Christians are not biblical literalists, and many of them accept that the world is billions of years old, but they still want to give God a bit part in the whole history of life. Some of them come to a theory called theistic evolution, and it's a very difficult claim to disprove. The claim is simply that God designed the universe to unfold according to the laws of nature, such as evolution, but he nudged it in the right direction. Maybe he provided the spark to produce the first replicating RNA molecules, and he caused a few mutations to happen in a certain place, which led to a certain evolutionary avenue being taken over others, and hence the arrival of humanity. Now, as a scientist, I can't say much against this. I can't disprove it entirely, of course, but there certainly isn't any need for it as a theory, and hence via Occam's razor I reject it myself. But Hovind also rejects it for totally different reasons. He says that there is no middle ground. Either you accept biblical literalism and all it entails regarding unscientific historical views of the earth, or else you're an evil atheist and you'll burn in hell. Hovind's argument against theistic evolution is that God doesn't use misfits, blind chance and death to create humanity. He gets it right first time. Except, of course, he didn't. That's the whole Noah thing, the wiping out almost every living thing idea. That's because God got it very wrong first time, and he used death to sort it out, as he often tends to do. And then in the New Testament he uses a bunch of 12 misfits from all walks of life, uneducated, simple men, to accompany his own son around on his travels. Hovind's argument here doesn't even pass the most basic scrutiny. The Bible Code was publicised by a book of the same name, published in 1997, and authored by American journalist and author Michael Drosnin. Drosnin claims that there is a code deep within the Bible which was put there, he believes, by intelligent extraterrestrial life forms. He thinks that you can find this code using the ancient superstition of numerology, That is, playing with letters and words and rearranging them in whatever order you like until something remarkable appears, as, just by the laws of chance, it always will. But of course you can get similar codes from any book you choose. In fact, Drosnin famously laid down this challenge: "When my critics find a message about the assassination of a Prime Minister encrypted in Moby Dick, I'll believe them." So a group of scientists went out and did exactly that. As you can see on this slide, Moby Dick quite accurately predicts the death and the manner of execution of Leon Trotsky, the first leader of the Russian Red Army and second only to Lenin in the communist government in the 1920s. Drosnin didn't say much in response to that. Numerology in all its guises is merely a way of predicting the past, using selective guesswork. And pretty much anyone can do that. Perhaps Drosnin would like to predict some specific events that will happen in the future. Maybe the names of the next 10 American presidents, or the date of the next major tsunami. He can't, of course. Not until after it happens, that is, when he'll mysteriously find it hidden somewhere in the Torah after all. But of course he's pretty much guaranteed to find it. As mathematicians have pointed out, if you get enough letters together in a grid, you're going to find words spelt out that you didn't expect. And I'm afraid that the secret to the Bible code is basically nothing more than that. After all, how else could you explain that it works in Hebrew and English? Modern English, of course, not English from 500 years ago that gets totally different messages. And pretty much any other language you can name. The sad thing is that some creationists seem to take this not only as proof that the Bible is important, but also that it is somehow without error, when in reality they've just been fooled by mathematics. One point that I deliberately haven't tried to counter before is the claim that the US Constitution doesn't say anything about the separation of church and state, and hence that teaching creationism in science classrooms is somehow okay. Well, I'm not a lawyer or an expert in US history, but I understand that Thomas Jefferson wrote a letter fairly clearly explaining that the US Constitution was designed to build a wall separating church and state, and then it was supposed to ensure that religious affiliations do not overlap with political business. I think that this is a laudable and wise safeguard, but of course it's totally irrelevant to the question at hand. If creationism were correct, and provably so, then it would no longer be just a religion, it would also get taught in science lessons. Of course it isn't right, it's manifestly wrong, and so it clings on merely as a religious belief, which seems, legally at least, to be another way of saying that it's a work of pure fantasy. I personally think that the debate is totally misplaced. We don't have a separation of church and state in the UK, but yet we keep creationism out of science lessons. Why? Because it's just wrong. We don't need any other reason, and neither should anyone else. Arguing that we shouldn't teach creationism because it's religious misses the point entirely. We shouldn't teach it because it's provably false. The more we concentrate on the former, the more we ignore the latter, and the less clear it becomes in the minds of the general public. This is the very last slide in my 25 lecture presentation series on science and creationism, inspired by and in direct response to the presentations of young earth creationist Kent Hovind. I would love to say something profound and meaningful here, but I think it's much more instructive just to give a few simple arguments about why I think this is important, why creationism is so prevalent, and why it must be opposed by all right-minded people. But it's really important to stress that I don't believe creationists are stupid. Yes, they believe something that's nonsensical, but then so have lots of clever people. Isaac Newton believed in alchemy, and he was a genius, perhaps one of the greatest geniuses ever to live. He was just ignorant of modern science, and that's the case with most creationists. Of course, some are more malicious than that. They want to get creationism taught in schools and accepted everywhere, and they're happy to lie, cheat and deceive to achieve this. But most creationists are decent, honest folk who genuinely think that they know the truth, and it's being trampled underfoot by a cold, unfeeling materialism. Creationism is a delusional belief. But again, we're probably all guilty of delusional beliefs. Most of us think that we're funnier than average, cleverer than average, better drivers than average, and more moral than average, and there's good research to back up all of those claims. Delusional beliefs are held despite and often in the face of the evidence, not because of it, so providing more evidence against them rarely has a desired effect. When you think about it, creationism is an arrogant belief. In order for creationists to believe what they do, they must also believe that they're cleverer and more honest than millions of the brightest people on Earth. They must believe that apparently trivial flaws in scientific theories have been totally missed and overlooked by all these millions of people, and yet they're so simple that anyone can understand them. As I said earlier, don't waste your time debating creationists. Debate favours style over content, it favours anecdote and emotive language over facts, and it favours propaganda over honesty. You will lose, and you will provide the creationists with a huge media coup. Don't do it. Let's face it, unless you're Carl Sagan, then they've got a better story to tell than you have. It may be false, but it's a good story. Finally, after spending so long attacking what is false, let's just focus on what is true. Science has dragged humanity out of the dirt and despair of the Dark Ages, and it has sent us to the surface of the moon and to the depths of the deepest oceans. It has given us glimpses of other worlds, and it has granted us lives of ease, comfort and safety that our ancestors would never have known. It has produced a myriad of new pleasures and experiences, and has given the average human being an extra 50 years of life on this planet to enjoy them. It grants hope to the suffering, comfort to the lonely, warmth to those who are cold, and refreshment to those who are in need of it. The only reason why I'm speaking to you now, through the mysterious wires and cables of the internet, is because millions of human beings realised what the young Earth creationists are saying is not only palpable nonsense, but it's also a sad, backward and highly damaging delusion which aims to take away all that is good about our world, to deny the truth and interconnectedness of all existence, and to replace it with violent and superstitious myths. Evolution, geology and all of science have given us a unique perspective on the universe that our ancestors were never lucky enough to have. You are extremely fortunate to be living here and now, and thanks to science, we know that the solutions to many more of mankind's problems are in good hands. Well, for one last time, that's all for now. As ever, there's loads more information on my website at frame.net, where you can also find a transcript of this talk and all the talks in this series. I promise I'll get them all up there very soon and replace the older versions that are currently available. You can keep up to date with my blog as well, and you can learn about some of my other work. I'm working on a new series of presentations on specific topics, and I'll be announcing more about those soon, so stay tuned. But for now, at the end of this series of presentations on science and creationism, I hope you learned something. I hope that maybe I've convinced you to think in a more scientific way. But most of all, I hope that I've at least shown you that our one key to success and happiness is to be honest about what is true, and to take the courage to admit it. Thanks for listening.